An unofficial top speed of Mach 3.3, the ability to fly over 85,000 feet and outrun missiles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird is arguably one of the most iconic aircraft of all time, and we finally have a radio-controlled version of it. I'm Alex from Hangar 14, and here's everything you need to know before you fly the E-Flite SR-71 Blackbird. E-Flite introduced us to the snack-size SR-71 near the end of the summer in 2023. With a total length of 37.6 inches and a wingspan of just 19.9 inches, it puts this plane right around the same size as your typical 64mm EDF jets. However, instead of being powered by a single 64mm ducted fan, we instead have two 40mm ducted fans being spun by a pair of 6800 kV brushless motors. The recommended battery pack for this is a 4-cell 2200 mAh LiPo pack like we have here, which E-Flite loves to use, giving us a total takeoff weight of right around 29.4 ounces. Now this is offered as a bind and fly basic airplane, essentially meaning all you need is a transmitter to bind it to and a battery pack to power it up, and you're good to go. Like most airplanes from E-Flite and Horizon nowadays, the SR-71 is equipped with AS3X and SAFE to keep this thing as stable as possible in the air, which I'll be honest, is probably necessary on a model like this, but we'll touch on that in just a second. Overall, this plane looks absolutely incredible. The molded EPO foam gives us an incredible attention to scale details like body lines and panel lines and things like that, and it just looks really clean. You'll notice that the included landing gear pay respect to the real SR-71 with the triple wheel setup on the main gear, but as you can imagine, on a plane this size, we do not get retractable landing gear, and these just snap into place. Two sets of vertical stabilizers are included. Installed here, I have the black set of vertical stabs to match the rest of the plane. However, you also get this red pair that you can also use if you'd like to help with visibility while in the air. Now, you'll also notice with that we have no rudder control on this plane, and the main control surfaces are actually just going to be these elevons that you can find on the back of the plane. And that's it. We do manage to get a steerable nose wheel, which is definitely needed when taking off from a paved surface and helps steer the plane down the runway. Now, the control surfaces on this are operated through 4 Spectrum linear servos, which come already installed. And this definitely helps keep things lightweight, compact as much as possible, which is really important on a model this size. So that's pretty much the basic overview of this SR-71. Now, if you've been looking at this thing online, you probably knew most of that by now. But what I really want to talk about here is some of the things that I've learned and have noticed since owning and flying this thing for the past couple of months. The good, the maybe not so good, and definitely some things that you should have some insight on before you go out for your first flight. Let's start with the good, because honestly, I really do like this plane, and the idea of having an RC SR-71 is just awesome. Out of the very flat box that this thing comes in, you're looking at pretty much zero assembly time, besides picking out which vertical stabs you want to use and snapping in the landing gear. Looking at the servos and connections on this plane, you'll notice that it uses ball link connectors, which is nice for adjustment if you ever need to do that, and it just keeps them working really smoothly, and you don't really have anything to worry about there. Now, one of the reasons I decided to pick this thing up over some of the other planes is, one, it's an SR-71 obviously, but two, it also runs off the same 2200 mAh LiPo pack that a lot of the other planes from Horizon and E-Flite use, meaning I didn't have to go buy another battery pack. I can just use the ones that I have for planes such as my Turbo Timber or my F-15 sitting back here. They all use this 2200 4-cell battery, which is awesome. You don't have to spend more money on batteries, you can use the ones that you already have. Now, since we aren't dealing with a large wingspan by any means, getting this plane to the flying site is relatively easy. I literally just throw it into the back seat of my car. We also do have this front nose cone, which does come off. It is like a soft plastic, more rubber, that does just snap on here, so you can take it off when you're transporting it, so it doesn't like bump up against anything and break this. This does bend, and just know that you'll never get this perfectly straight. Trust me, I've tried. But for $250, I think you're getting a pretty sweet deal with this thing. Typically, anything with 2 motors is going to drive up the price significantly, but we aren't dealing with things such as rudders or flaps or retracts that usually drive up that cost. So we are sitting at that $250 price range, which is great, because right now it's one of my favorite planes to bring with me anytime I go out to the field, simply because it just looks so good. However, that doesn't mean this thing comes without its flaws. Now take that and everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt, but I think it's important to be critical on these kinds of things because, you know, it's really easy to see something like an SR-71 and want to hop into it right away, but without knowing some of its quirks and flying characteristics, you can end up with a crumpled up pile of foam relatively quick. Now, the first thing I'll say about this plane, that even though it is smaller and it's pretty light, it does feel heavy when it's in the air. As you can imagine, taking a design such as the SR-71 and shrinking it down to something of this size comes with its own set of challenges to overcome. The small wingspan, like I said, makes it great to throw into a car, but it doesn't provide you with much lift at all. You can tell that when you're flying this thing, those twin 6800 kV brushless motors and 40mm fans are what is keeping you in the air, as you'll be pretty much flying this thing at full throttle the entire time. This thing relies on speed to fly, which makes sense. I mean, it's an SR-71. It's literally what it was designed and built to do. However, it never really feels like you have the authority to go into any sort of climb. You can definitely tell that you need to build up airspeed before you're going into any sort of maneuver, whether that be a climb, an aerobatic maneuver, anything. One of the SR-71's distinctive features are these right here, the engine nacelle intake cones. Now, these are essential for the real SR-71 to keep its engines fed with air when it's traveling at supersonic speed. However, on a model such as this, they look great and are definitely needed to pull off the whole look of the SR-71, but putting a giant hunk of plastic right in the intake for your electric ducted fan is a great way to kill efficiency. As you can see near the back of the tail here where the motors actually sit, we do have some additional intakes to help bring in more air, but I do feel that these engine cones have quite a negative impact when it comes to the model's performance. Now, this is where I think the AS3X and the Safe play a huge role when it comes to this plane, as it's keeping this thing from wanting to roll over on its back in tighter turns and from wobbling back and forth at lower speeds. Kind of like the X-29, if you know that plane. That plane aerodynamically should not fly. It relies on all of its computers and inputs to stay airborne. And it's kind of the same thing with this, it feels like. It does fly, and it does fly pretty well when it's up to speed, but it could just use a little more power behind it. Now, with a few packs burned through, there are some things that I've learned that I think you should definitely know before you pick this thing up and before you take it out on its first flight. Number one, if you plan on using the landing gear like I have here, you 100% need a paved surface. There's no way that you will be able to take off a grass runway with the tiny wheels that are on this thing. And if that's the case, be prepared for a long takeoff roll. It does take a bit for this thing to get up to the speed that it needs to be able to rotate and take off, since the wheelbase on it is so long. Number two, as soon as you go to rotate, you'll realize that you have like an inch of clearance before you start dragging the rear end of this thing on the ground. It sits really low, and during takeoff and landing, it's super easy to scrape if you're not careful. The good news is, however, they did keep that in mind, and the back portion here that would make a contact with the ground is made of a harder plastic. So you're not gonna be scraping away any foam or anything like that, and it does hold up pretty well. But I was already pretty cautious of this going into it and tried to take it easy on takeoff and landing and still managed to scuff it up pretty good already. So just keep that in mind. Number three, back to the note of the landing gear, make sure they are actually snapped into place. The first flight I actually had this thing, thought everything was going good, which it was until it came in for the landing, and the rear landing gear just ended up shooting out right out of the side of the airplane, and it dragged the whole thing across the blacktop, leaving a bunch of areas that I had to go back and touch up with some Sharpie. So make sure they are actually locked in, otherwise you're gonna be skipping this thing across the ground like I did. Number four, the red tails that they include, they make absolute sense. All right, with over 20 years of flying experience under my belt, I immediately kind of just threw those red tails into like the spare parts bin. I don't need those. I want this thing to look sick and all murdered out and like it should be. Well, I did quickly realize why they include those. This thing is difficult to see in the air. The profile, as you can see, is super thin. And I was actually pretty surprised as to how many times I did lose a little bit of orientation with it when I was flying, especially if it's later in the day. Now, I know it might hurt the ego a little bit, but don't be afraid to use those red tails. They do help a ton. And finally, number five, I would recommend using a large area to fly this in. I know the videos that I'm showing here are literally me flying it off a road, but don't be like me. Give yourself as much room as possible. The flight characteristics characteristics of this plane, like I mentioned before, feel a little bit heavier. You want to be more gentle on the sticks, which forces you to make longer swooping turns in maneuvers, which requires more space than you would originally think. Plus, that's with me flying without any safe assistance, and I would imagine when you have safe turned on, those turns would be even bigger because it limits how much you can roll. Now, with all of that said, it's easy to see why this is labeled as a level 3 experience required airplane. If you go on Horizon, they have them based into skill levels. This is a skill level 3. And I've been flying for a long time and have flown a wide variety of planes, and I'm not gonna lie, this one still does get my palms sweating every now and then. It just flies unlike anything that I've really flown before, and probably different from something that you're probably used to, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that you should be ready for. Like I mentioned before, taking something like the SR-71, shrinking it down, and turning it into a flyable RC model is no small feat, which is why we probably haven't seen it done much before. Is it perfect? I wouldn't say so. Does that mean it's bad? Absolutely not. I look forward to getting some more flights in with this thing and seeing how it handles with some hand launching, with no landing gear, see if that changes any of the characteristics around. So if you'd like to see any of that, have any questions, or have any recommendations on what you would like to see us cover here next, drop it down in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any upcoming content. I'm Alex from Hangar 14. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.